Hi Ling 101. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do morphological analysis using a dataset from Swahili. So we have a list of verbs from Swahili, and our goal is going to be to try to identify all the different morphemes that attach to a verb that appear in this dataset, figure out the meaning of each morpheme, and figure out where it gets attached. So is it a prefix, is it a suffix, is it something else, and do they need to be attached to the root in a particular order? So the first thing that we want to do is to try to divide each word into morphemes. And so we need to figure out where the morpheme boundaries are. Where does each morpheme begin and where does each one end? And so the way that you want to do that is by comparing two or more words that have one morpheme in common so that you can try to isolate that morpheme and figure out, okay, this sequence of sounds appears in both or all of these words, so this is probably a certain morpheme. Now, by comparing all the words in this word list, one thing that you should notice by looking at the English translations is that they all have the same root, which is sleep. So that means that we can start by looking for that root. So if you look at all the words in this list, if you try to see what do all of these words have in common, you should notice that all of them end in la la. And so that's the only thing that is the same in all of these words. And so we can guess that that is probably the root, and we'll work from that hypothesis. So we're going to divide up each of the words, putting a morpheme boundary before lala. And now we can probably divide up these morphemes a little bit further. And so let's look at what comes before that root. One thing that you should notice, again, you need to look at the English translations to figure this out, is that some of these verbs have he/she as the subject, and some of them have they as the subject. Now, if you look at the verbs that have he/she as the subject, you should notice that those verbs all begin with ah. And then if you look at the ones that have they as the subject, you'll notice those all begin with wa. All right, so we can guess that a is probably a morpheme that means he or she, and then wa is a morpheme that means they. And so if we put more morpheme boundaries there, we're going to end up with this division. And so that leaves us with another morpheme in the middle. And if we compare those morphemes to the English translations and look at the verb tenses, we will see that each of those morphemes from the middle of the word line up with the verb tenses. So it seems like we have a correct morpheme division here. All right, so now it's time to try to identify the meaning of each of these morphemes. So again, we're going to compare each word to the English translation and figure out which part of the word seems to go with which component of meaning in the translation. And so we've already noticed that lala is the root for sleep, and we have found that ah is the morpheme for he, she, and then wa is the morpheme for they. And then we can also compare the morphemes that come in the middle to each of the verb tenses. And so here's what we can end up with. So we know that in these Swahili verbs, the root of the verb comes at the end, and that means that the morphemes that attach to it are all prefixes. So the very first prefix that appears is going to be the subject prefix. So we have a, which means he or she, and we have wa, which means they. And then after the subject prefix closest to the verb root, we have another prefix, which is the verb tense. So we can find that the prefix me is for present perfect, and then na is for present progressive, and ta is future. And so now we have a complete list of all the meanings in this data set. including the meanings of every morpheme. We have identified that the subject and the verb tense are prefixes that are attached before the verb root, and that the subject prefix comes first, followed by the verb tense prefix, and then finally by the verb root. And so now this accounts for all of our data.